Part 7, Chapter 2 of The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook. Chapter 2, The Mystical Way. Mysticism, to dwell on the unseen, to withdraw ourselves from the things of sense into communion with God, to endeavour to partake of the divine nature, that is, of holiness. When we ask ourselves only what is right or what is the will of God, the same question, then we may truly be said to live in his light. Florence Nightingale. It has been mentioned incidentally in an earlier chapter that Miss Nightingale was fond of reading the books of Catholic devotion which the Reverend Mother of the Bermondsey Convent used to send her. Long before, she had studied carefully the writings of the Port Royalists, and at the Trinità de Monte she had seen the ideal of Catholic devotion in real life. She used to pass on some of her devotional works to Mr. Jowett. He began with Saint Teresa, and at first repelled, he gradually became interested. Miss Nightingale was in the habit of copying out passages for her own edification, sometimes in the original, sometimes translating them. The idea of making a selection for publication occurred to her, and Mr. Jowett encouraged it. "Do not give up your idea," he said, "of making a selection of the better mind of the Middle Ages and the mystics. You will do a good work," he wrote again, October 3, 1872, "if you point out the kind of mysticism which is needed in the present day. Not mysticism at all, but as intense a feeling as the mystics had, of the power of truth and reason, and of the will of God that they should take effect in the world. The passion of the reason, the fusion of faith and reason, the reason in religion, and the religion in reason. If you can only describe these, you will teach people a new lesson. The new has something still to learn from the old, and I am not certain whether we ought not to retire into mysticism. I thought I should not use the word, when the antagonism with existing opinions becomes too great." Miss Nightingale's close study of Plato and of the Bible, described in the last chapter, increased her interest in Christian mysticism. The fourth Gospel was the work of a mystic, and there were curious analogies, which she pointed out to Mr. Jowett, between Plato and the mediaeval mystics. The famous myth of the purified soul, for instance, recalled a passage in the Fioretti of St. Francis, except that there the purgatorial stage, before the wings grow, lasts 150 years instead of 10,000. Miss Nightingale said of the closing prayer in the Phaedrus, "Give me beauty in the inward soul, and may the outward and inward man be at one." A prayer unequalled, she thought, by any collect in the service book, that it put in 17 words the whole or at least half of the doctrine of St. John of the Cross. Plato made her the more interested in the Christian mystics, the Christian mystics the more interested in Plato. Concurrently with her work for Mr. Jowett's revised Plato, she gave much time during 1873 and 1874, with additions in later years, to transcribing or translating and arranging passages from devotional writers of the Middle Ages. She had sent some of her book in various stages to Mr. Jowett, who, with other suggestions, said, April 18, 1873, that she ought to add a preface showing the use of such books. They are apt to appear unreal, and yet Thomas à Kempis has been one of the most influential books in the world. The subject of the preface should be the use of the ideal, and especially the spiritual ideal. I do not say what may be the case with great saints themselves, but for us I think it is clear that this mystic state ought to be an occasional and not a permanent feeling, a taste of heaven in daily life. Do you think it would be possible to write a mystical book which would also be the essence of common sense? 2. I construct the preface from various notes and rough drafts in Miss Nightingale's hand. It may seem a strange thing to begin a book with, "This book is not for any one who has time to read it," but the meaning of it is. This reading is good only as a preparation for work. If it is not to inspire life and work, it is bad. Just as the end of food is to enable us to live and work, and not to live and eat, so the end of most reading perhaps, but certainly of mystical reading, is not to read but to work. For what is mysticism? Is it not the attempt to draw near to God, not by rites or ceremonies, but by inward disposition? Is it not merely a hard word for "the kingdom of heaven is within"? Heaven is neither a place nor a time. There might be a heaven not only here, but now. It is true that sometimes we must sacrifice not only health of body, but health of mind, or peace, in the interest of God. That is, we must sacrifice heaven. But "thou shalt be like God, for thou shalt see him as he is." This may be here and now, as well as there and then. And it may be for a time, then lost, then recovered, both here and there, both now and then. That religion is not devotion, but work and suffering for the love of God. This is the true doctrine of mystics, as is more particularly set forth in a definition of the 16th century. True religion is to have no other will but God's. Compare this with the definition of religion in Johnson's dictionary: virtue founded upon reverence of God and expectation of future rewards and punishments. In other words, on respect and self-interest, not love. Imagine the religion which inspired the life of Christ founded on the motives given by Dr. Johnson. Christ himself was the first true mystic. "My meat is to do the will of him that sent me, and to finish his work." What is this but putting in fervent and the most striking words the foundation of all real mystical religion, which is that for all our actions, all our words, all our thoughts, the food upon which they are to live and have their being is to be the indwelling presence of God, the union with God, that is, with the Spirit of goodness and wisdom. Where shall I find God? In myself. That is the true mystical doctrine. But then I myself must be in a state for him to come and dwell in me. This is the whole aim of the mystical life, and all mystical rules in all times and countries have been laid down for putting the soul into such a state. That the soul herself should be heaven, that our Father which is in heaven should dwell in her, that there is something within us infinitely more estimable than often comes out, that God enlarges this palace of our soul by degrees so as to enable her to receive himself, that thus he gives her liberty, but that the soul must give herself up absolutely to him for him to do this. The incalculable benefit of this occasional but frequent intercourse with the perfect. This is the conclusion and sum of the whole matter, put into beautiful language by the mystics. And of this process they describe the steps, and assign periods of months and years, during which the steps, they say, are commonly made by those who make them at all. These old mystics, whom we call superstitious, were far before us in their ideas of God and of prayer, that is, of our communion with God. Prayer, says a mystic of the 16th century, is to ask not what we wish of God, but what God wishes of us. Master, who hast made and formed the vessel of the body of thy creature, and hast put within so great a treasure, the soul, which bears the image of thee. So begins a dying prayer of the 14th century. In it, and in the other prayers of the mystics, there is scarcely a petition. There is never a word of the theory that God's dealings with us are to show his power, still less of the theory that of his own good pleasure he has predestined any souls to eternal damnation. There is little mention of heaven for self, of desire of happiness for self, none. It is singular how little mention there is either of intercession or of atonement by another's merits. True it is that we can only create a heaven for ourselves and others by the merits of another, since it is only by working in accordance with God's laws that we can do anything. But there is nothing at all in these prayers as if God's anger had to be bought off, as if he had to be bribed into giving us heaven by sufferings merely to satisfy God's justice. In the dying prayers there is nothing of the egotism of death. It is the reformation of God's church, that is, God's children, for whom the self would give itself, that occupies the dying thoughts. There is not often a desire to be released from trouble and suffering. On the contrary, there is often a desire to suffer the greatest suffering, and to offer the greatest offering, with even greater pain, if so any work can be done. And still this and all is ascribed to God's goodness. The offering is not to buy anything by suffering, but if only the suppliant can do anything for God's children. These suppliants did not live to see the reformation of God's children. No more will any who now offer these prayers, but at least we can all work towards such practical reformation. The way to live with God is to live with ideas, not merely to think about ideals, but to do and suffer for them. Those who have to work on men and women must, above all things, have their spiritual ideal, their purpose, ever present. The mystical state is the essence of common sense. The authors whom Miss Nightingale read for the purpose of her selection included Saint Angela of Foligno, Madame de Châtel, Saint Francis of Assisi, Saint Francis Xavier, Saint John of the Cross, Peter of Alcantara, Father Rigauloux, Saint Teresa, and Father Serin. She arranged her extracts from these and other writers under headings and supplied marginal summaries. She prepared also a title page. Notes from devotional authors of the Middle Ages, collected, chosen, and freely translated by Florence Nightingale. 3. This and all other literary work was interrupted, however, at the beginning of 1874 by the death of her father. She was in London. Her sister and Sir Harry Verney were with him, and Mrs. Nightingale at Embley. He was 80, but though his strength of body and mind had failed a little, he had been out for his usual ride a few days before. Lady Verney had wished him good night. "Say not good night," he said in reply, quoting Mrs. Barbauld, "but in some brighter clime bid me good morning." A day or two later he came down to breakfast as usual, but found that he had forgotten his watch. He went to fetch it, slipped upon the stairs, and died on the spot. Miss Nightingale felt the loss of her father deeply. "His reverent love for you," wrote Lord Houghton in a letter of condolence, January 13, 1874, "was inexpressibly touching, and her love for him, though of a different kind, was very tender." Unlike in many respects, father and daughter were yet kindred spirits in intellectual curiosity, in a taste for speculative inquiry. M. Mohl noted among Mr. Nightingale's engaging characteristics a modest curiosity about everything, a surprised, innocent, incredulous smile as he listened intently. Miss Irby spoke of his exceeding sweetness and childlikeness of wisdom. These qualities were conspicuous in much of his intercourse with his daughter Florence, and she was now deprived of the father who had, in things of the mind, sat at her feet and sympathized in her searches after truth. The death of her father was quickly followed on January 31, 1874, by that of her dearly loved friend Mrs. Bracebridge. "She was more than mother to me," wrote Florence to M. and Madame Mohl, February 3, "and oh that I could not be a daughter to her in her last sad days. What should I have been without her, and what would many have been without her? To one living with her as I did once, she was unlike any other human being, as unlike as a picture of a sunny scene is to the real light and warmth of sunshine. Or as this February lamp we call our sun is to her own sun of living light in Greece. Other people live together to make each other worse. She lived with all to make them better. And she was not like a chastened Christian saint, no more like that than Apollo, but she had qualities which no Greek god ever had, real humility. Excepting my dear father, I never knew any one so really humble, and with it the most active heart and mind and buoyant soul that could well be conceived. Mr. Bracebridge had died 18 months before, July 18, 1872, and Miss Nightingale had said he and she have been the creators of my life. And when I think of him at Scutari, the only man in all England who would have lived with willingness such a pigging life without the interest and responsibility which it had to me, I think that we shall never look upon his like again. And when I think of Atherstone, of Athens, of all the places I have been in with them, of the immense influence they had in shaping my own life, more than earthly father and mother to me, I cannot doubt that they leave behind them, having shaped many lives as they did mine, their mark on the century. This century, which has so little ideal, at least in England. They were so immeasurably above any English country gentry I have ever known. Miss Nightingale's estimate of her friends was shared by others who had enjoyed their hospitality. The death of Mrs. Bracebridge, wrote M. Mohl, February 14, is a sad blow for you. The breaking of these old associations, which nothing new can replace, impoverishes one's life, and a part of ourselves dies out with old friends, even if they have not been to us what Mrs. Bracebridge was to you. Und immer stiller wird's und stiller auf unserem Pfad, until the great problem of life opens for ourselves. Two better people than the Bracebridges, different as they were, I have never seen. Madame d'Abbadie has a queer expression for a woman she approves of. She says, "Elle est honnête homme," and nothing is more appropriate to Mrs. Bracebridge. I can never think of Atherstone without emotion. It is people like these in whom lies the glory of England and the strength of the country. They were so genuine, so ready to help and to impoverish themselves for public purposes, and to do it unostentatiously and without fishing for popularity. To the end of her life, Miss Nightingale cherished the memory of these faithful and helpful friends. "To my beloved and revered friends," she said in her will, "Mr. Charles Bracebridge and his wife, my more than mother, without whom Scutari and my life could not have been, and to whom nothing that I could ever say or do would in the least express my thankfulness, I should have left some token of my remembrance had they, as I expected, survived me." The death of her companion at Scutari removed one of the few links with Miss Nightingale's happier past. The death of her father was not only a bereavement which she felt deeply, it also involved her in much distracting business. Her father's landed properties at Embley and Lea Hurst now passed under the entail to his sister, Aunt Mai, and her husband. Florence did not attend her father's funeral, but soon she went down to Embley to look after her mother. There, and afterwards in London, she was immersed in worrying affairs. Her only comfort, she wrote repeatedly in private notes, was the goodness of Mr. Shore Smith, her boy of old days. The letters of Mr. Coltman, one of her father's executors, were full of humour, but Florence was never able to take things lightly. There were questions of property and residence to be discussed, servants to be dismissed and engaged, her mother's immediate movements and future mode of life to be settled. Everybody had a different plan, and Florence complained that nobody but she had the same plan for 2 days running. Her letters and notes at this period are of a quite tragic intensity. Something may be ascribed to a characteristic over-emphasis. "We Smiths," she said once of herself, "all exaggerate. And Mr. Jowett said of some remarks made by her about him, "You are as nearly right as an habitual spirit of exaggeration will ever allow you to be." "We are a great many, too many strong characters," she wrote of herself and her family, "and very different, all pulling different ways. And we are so dreadfully au sérieux. Oh, how much good it does us to have some one to laugh at us." But there was no exaggeration in one of her woes. A third of her time was taken up with the Nightingale nurses, another third with Indian affairs, for in relation to India, as we shall hear, she never quite went out of office. The remaining third, which might have been devoted to working out a scheme of social and moral science on the statistical methods of M. Quetelet, or on preparing for the press her selections from the mystics, was being wasted in family worries. M. Quetelet, with whom she had been corresponding, had recently died. "I cannot say," she wrote to Dr. Farr, February 23, 1874, "how the death of our old friend touches me. He was the founder of the most important science in the whole world. Some months ago I prepared the first sketch of an essay I meant to publish and dedicate to him on the application of his discoveries to explain the plan of God in teaching us by these results the laws by which our moral progress is to be attained. I had pleased myself with thinking that this would please him, but painful and indispensable business prevented the finishing of my paper. O God," she exclaimed in the bitterness of her heart, "let me not sink in these perplexities, but give me a great cause to do and die for." And again, "What makes the difference between man and woman? Quetelet did his work, and I am so disturbed by my family that I can't do mine." 4. So then Miss Nightingale never finished her book on the mystics, but she did something which, if we take her view of literary work, we may account far better. She lived it. No words of Florence Nightingale's that have been quoted in the course of this memoir are more intensely autobiographical, none express more truly the spirit in which she lived and moved and had her being, than those which I have put together on a preceding page from her notes on the mystics. Her creed may seem cold to some minds, but she invested it with a spiritual fervour which none of the mystics has surpassed. This woman, so practical, so businesslike, and in her outward dealings with men and affairs, so worldly wise, was a dreamer, a devotee, a religious enthusiast. The Lady in Chief, who was to others a tower of strength, was to herself a weak vessel, praying continually for support, and conscious with bitter intensity of shortcoming, of faithlessness, of rebellion to the will of God. Self-possessed in the presence of others, she was tortured and agonized, often to the verge of despair, in the solitude of her chamber. "I have done nothing for 7 years," she said to a friend, "but write regulations." And that was broadly true of one side of her life. Of another side, she might have said with almost equal truth, "I have done nothing all my life but write spiritual meditations." She lived with a pen or pencil ever at her side, and reams of her paper are covered with confessions, self-examinations, communings with God. She suffered much, and especially during these years, from sleeplessness, and in the watches of the night she would turn to read the mystics for comfort, or to write on her tablets for spiritual exercise. Though she liked best the books of the Catholic saints, her Catholicism was wider than theirs, and she could find spiritual kinship also, as in the lines prefixed to the present part, with the hymns of American evangelists. At one and the same time, mystic and practical administrator, Miss Nightingale had two soul sides, but each was a reflection of the other. Her religion was her work, and her work was her religion. She read the mystics, not to lull her active faculties into contemplative ecstasy, but to consecrate them to more perfect service. In one place she makes these notes from St. Catherine of Siena: "It is not the occupation, but the spirit, which makes the difference. The election of a bishop may be a most secular thing; the election of a representative may be a religious thing. It is not the preluding such an election with public prayer that would make it a religious act. It is religious so far as each man discharges his part as a duty and a solemn responsibility. The question is not whether a thing is done for the state or the church, but whether it is done with God or without God." Miss Nightingale's heading to this passage was "Drains." She applied her religion to every aspect of her life, and in her meditations passages of solemn profundity are sometimes side by side with entries of a quaint and almost humorous directness, like a gargoyle above a church porch or a dog in a Madonna picture. "O Lord, I offer him to Thee. He is so heavy. Do Thou take care of him. I can't. I must strive to see only God in my friends, and God in my cats." Such passages are thought profane by professors of a purely formal religion, but are characteristic of the true mystics in all denominations. The mystical self-abasement of the saints was never more complete than in the private meditations of Florence Nightingale. Once in the middle of the night she started up and saw pictures on the wall by the night-light lamp. "Am I she who once stood on that Crimean height? The lady with a lamp shall stand. The lamp shows me only my utter shipwreck." From the year 1872 onwards, when she went out of office, and with increased intensity after her father's death, Miss Nightingale's mood in all communings with herself was of deep dejection and of utter humbleness. The notes are often heart-rending in their impression of loneliness, of craving for sympathy which she could not find, of bitter self-reproach. The loss of friends may account for something of all this, and even her friendship with Mr. Jowett had now lost somewhat of its consoling power. She felt that she gave more sympathy than she received. She sometimes found her interviews with him exhausting or disturbing. "He talks to me," she said once, "as if I were someone else." The strange manner of her life should be remembered. Her habit of seeing only one person at a time, and that at set times, must have made intercourse rather formidable for both parties. Nobody, even if staying in the house, ever happened to come into her room, and no outside visitor appeared unexpectedly. She never had the relief of hearing two other people talk, or of witnessing, even for a moment, two other personalities in contact. Something, too, must be accounted to the fact that many of her meditations were written at night, or in the early morning hours when she could not sleep. Periods of sleepless dejection, which in the lives of most men and women leave little record of themselves behind, were by her spent in writing down their weary tale. No doubt the self-expression gave relief, and she would often turn at the instant from her tablets of despair to amuse a visitor with humorous conversation, or write a vivacious letter to a friend. These are considerations for which allowance must be made in estimating what was morbid in Miss Nightingale's moods. But for the most part the despondency and the self-abasement which coloured her meditations, and which sometimes appear in her letters, were the expression of the mystical way of her soul. They are the utterance of a soul which was striving after perfection, and found the path difficult and thorny. Miss Nightingale was masterful and eager. She had often been able to impress her will upon men and upon events. She found it difficult to bear disappointments and vexations with that entire resignation which the mystics taught her. She was out of office. She had been interrupted suddenly and painfully in a long career of almost unceasing action. The pause in her public life gave her new occasion for self-criticism and fresh consciousness of the difficulty of sustaining in active life that absolute purity of motive which makes light even of success or failure. She strove to attain, and she taught others to ensue, passivity in action, to do the utmost in their power, but to leave the result to a higher power. In a poem which gave her much comfort in later years, she marked this passage: abstaining from attachment to the work, abstaining from rewardment in the work, while yet one doeth it full faithfully, saying, 'tis right to do, that is true act and abstinence. Who doeth duty so, unvexed if his work fail, if it succeed, unflattered, in his own heart justified, quit of debates and doubts, his is true act. But the lesson was hard to learn. There are trying days before us, she wrote to one of her dearest friends, August 1873. However, we cannot change a single hair. We must look to Him alike who grasps eternity and numbers every hair. I don't know that it is ever difficult to me to entrust my hair to Him, but to entrust A's and yours and poor matrons I find very difficult. And I thought He did not take care of B's hairs. What a reprobate I am! And a worse reprobate than this letter says, for in fact she did find it very difficult to entrust even her own hair to Him, as she confessed in another letter to the same friend. God is displeased when we inquire too anxiously. A soul which has really given itself to God does His will in the present and trusts to the Father for the future. Now it is 20 years today, August 11, 1873, since I entered public life, and I have not learnt that lesson yet, though the greater part of those 20 years have been as completely out of my hands to mould, and in His alone, as if they had been the movements of the planets. The surrender of her will to the keeping of the supreme will was the spiritual perfection at which she most continuously aimed. In consciousness of failure, she reproached herself for censoriousness, rebellion, impatience. She knew that some of all this, and much of her dejection, were morbid, and warned others against the like weakness. "Do not depend, darling," she wrote to a friend, "upon light in one sort of mystical way. There are things, as I know by experience, in which He sends us light by the hard good sense of others, not by our going over in sickness and solitude one thought, or rather feeling over and over again by ourselves, which rather brings darkness. I have felt this so much in my lonely life." But there was another mystical way in which she found strength. In her spiritual life, which was at once the complement and the sustaining source of her outward life, she followed, as she was fond of writing, the way of the cross. There were moments, indeed, but they were rare, in which she was inclined to draw back, and when her faith grew faint. "O my Creator, art Thou leading every man of us to perfection, or is this only a metaphysical idea for which there is no evidence? Is man only a constant repetition of himself? Thou knowest that through all these 20 horrible years, 1873, I have been supported by the belief, I think I must believe it still, or I am sure I could not work, that I was working with Thee, who wert bringing every one, even our poor nurses, to perfection." Yet from every doubt her assurance grew the stronger, and as she followed the way of the cross, she rose triumphant over suffering, finding in each loss of human sympathy a lesson that she should throw herself more entirely into the eternal arms, and in every outbreak of human despondency or rebellion a call to closer union with the eternal goodness. "O Father, I submit, I resign myself," she wrote in one of hundreds of similar meditations. I accept with all my heart this stretching out of thy hand to save me. Deal with me as thou seest meet. Thy work begin, thy work complete. Oh, how vain it is, the vanity of vanities, to live in men's thoughts instead of God's. And again, wretch that I was not to see that God was taking from me all human help in order to compel me to lean on him alone. She had little interest in rites and ceremonies as such, and she interpreted the doctrines of Christianity in her own way, but she found great comfort in the communion service as an expression of the individual believer's participation in the sufferings and the triumph of the greatest of the mystics. For some years she entered in her diary a text from the mystical writers for each day. She took to herself their devotion, their communion with God, their self-surrender. She adjusted their doctrine to her own beliefs. I believe, she wrote, in God the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in Jesus Christ, his best Son, our Master, who was born to show us the way through suffering, to be also his sons and his daughters, his handmen and his handmaidens, who lived in the same Spirit with the Father, that we may also live in that Holy Spirit whose meat was to do his Father's will and to finish his work, who suffered and died, saying that the world may love the Father. And I believe in the Father Almighty's love and friendship, in the service of man being the service of God, the growing into a likeness with him by love, the being one with him in will at last, which is heaven. I believe in the plan of almighty perfection to make us all perfect, and thus I believe in the life everlasting. This was the creed by which Miss Nightingale guided her life, this the path to perfection along which she ever moved. There was nothing ecstatic in her mysticism, though she notes occasionally that she heard the voice, and often that she was conscious of receiving strong impressions. They were impressions which came in moments of imaginative insight, but yet which followed rationally from self-examination and meditation on her creed. Patience and resignation were the states of the purified soul which she found hardest of attainment. She marked for her edification many a passage from devotional writers in which such virtues are enjoined, as in this from Thomas à Kempis: O Lord my God, patience is very necessary for me, for I perceive that many things in this life do fall out as we would not. It is so, my son, but my will is that thou seek not that peace which is void of temptations, or which suffereth nothing contrary, but rather think that thou hast found peace when thou art exercised with sundry tribulations and tried in many adversities. Her tribulations were often caused, she confessed, by her impatience. O Lord, even now I am trying to snatch the management of thy world out of thy hands. The middle path of perfection between the acquiescence of the quietist and the impatience of the worker was hard. Too little have I looked for something higher and better than my own work, the work of supreme wisdom, which uses us whether we know it or not. O God, to thy glory, not to mine, whatever happens, may be all my thought. Miss Nightingale's meditations, written in the purgatorial stage, are many and poignant, but there were times also when the mount of illumination was reached, when the palace of her soul was enlarged to receive the indwelling presence, and she found the perfect peace of the mystic in the consciousness of union with the supreme wisdom. Times when on the wings of the soul she attained with Dante to the Empyrean. Lume e lassù che visibile face lo creatore a quella creatura che solo in lui vedere ha la sua pace. Perfected in weakness, she was strong in moments of illumination to see God in all things and all things in God, the eternal shining through the accidents of space and time. End of The Mystical Way.
Part 7, Chapter 3 of The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Emily Olson. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook. Miss Nightingale's School, 1872 to 1879. Let each founder train as many in his or her spirit as he or she can. Then the pupils will in their turn be founders also. Florence Nightingale. Miss Nightingale did not do as she had planned and go in her own person to St. Thomas's Hospital, but in another sense the year 1872 was the year of her descent upon it. Not, indeed, as we saw in the preceding part, that she had ever abandoned a personal interest in the training school. But there were now new conditions which called for additional care, and Miss Nightingale, being out of office, was more free to give it. Henceforth she became, in a yet more direct manner than heretofore, the head of the Nightingale School, and the chief of the Nightingale nurses. The year 1871 had seen the removal of St. Thomas's Hospital from its temporary quarters in the old Surrey Gardens to the present building opposite the Houses of Parliament. The foundation stone had been laid by Queen Victoria in 1868. Miss Nightingale had been requested to ask the Queen to do this, and she had preferred the petition through Sir James Clark. "I never pressed Her Majesty so hard upon anything before," said he in announcing the royal pleasure. The Queen had again shown her interest in the hospital by opening the new building in June 1871. The number of beds was now greatly increased, and with it the number of nurses and probationers. The control of the nurses was likely to be relaxed as it was spread over a larger number, and Miss Nightingale resolved to hold a visitation. First she sent Dr. Sutherland, with the consent of the hospital authorities, to inspect the new buildings and to consider all the arrangements from the point of view of an expert sanitarian. She examined and cross-examined sisters and nurses on the same points, and put into print a list of the defects which needed remedy. Then Miss Nightingale took in hand the education, technical and moral, of her own Nightingale School. She had already observed that the lady probationers, appointed to responsible posts, were not always adequate to their duties. The overworked matron had perhaps sometimes recommended unsuitable persons. She found on questioning the nurses that their technical education did not reach the high standard which she desired to maintain. She feared that the moral standards similarly fell short of her ideal. Nursing was coming to be regarded too much as a business profession, and too little as a sacred calling. Miss Nightingale determined to throw herself into a sustained effort for the better realization of her ideal. Directly or indirectly she instituted sweeping reforms. The result of them was, as she wrote to Mr. Bonham Carter (August 1875), that the training school became "a home, a place of moral, religious, and practical training, a place of training of character, habits, intelligence, as well as of acquiring knowledge." Those who saw the Nightingale nurses in these years were struck by the bright, kindly, and pleasant spirit which seemed to pervade the company of them, and could well understand that the institution was really, as its foundress intended, a home as well as a school. Mr. Whitfield, the resident medical officer, who had acted since the foundation of the nursing school as medical instructor of the probationers, resigned that post, and Mr. J. Croft, who had lately become one of the surgeons to the hospital, was appointed in his stead. Miss Nightingale saw and corresponded with Mr. Croft and liked him much. "I have always dreaded," he wrote (February 24, 1873), "remaining a stagnant man. I hope to become, as you would have me, an active and faithful comrade." He gave clinical instruction to the probationers, delivered courses of lectures, general, medical, and surgical in the several terms, throughout the year, of which he submitted the syllabus to Miss Nightingale, and at her request drew up a course of reading for probationers. Other members of the medical staff gave courses of lectures also, and examinations were made more regular and searching. The answers written by probationers and their notes on the lectures were from time to time sent to Miss Nightingale, so that she might gain an idea of the general standard of instruction and perhaps administer rebuke or encouragement to individual pupils. "I think," Miss Nightingale was told on one occasion, "that the ladies are thoroughly ashamed of the appearance they made at Mr. Croft's last examination, and wish to retrieve themselves." Their good resolutions seem to have been successful, for presently one of the medical officers reported that "the answers which I have received this year collectively are much better than in former years. They are indeed exceedingly good." "I read your case papers," Miss Nightingale wrote in one of her addresses, "with more interest than if they were novels. Some are meagre, especially in the history of the cases; some are good. Please remember that, besides your own instruction, you can give me some too, by making these most interesting cases as interesting as possible, by making them accurate and entering into the full history." The new hospital had greatly increased the demands upon the time of the matron, Miss Wardroper, and left her less able to supervise the probationers. An assistant superintendent of the school was appointed with the title of Home Sister. It was one of her duties to supplement the lectures and bedside demonstration of the medical officers by regular class teaching. Miss Nightingale, however, attached even more importance to the Home Sister's influence on the moral and spiritual side of the school. The Home Sister was to encourage general reading, to arrange Bible classes, and to give interest to the nurses in order to keep them above the mere scrabble for a remunerative place. The two sides of the school are closely joined in the letters to Miss Nightingale from the Home Sister and matron, letters telling on one page of the progress of the probationers in antiseptic dressing and so forth, and on another of their Bible readings or selected hymns. Miss Nightingale was especially pleased when Canon Farrar allotted some seats at St. Margaret's to her nurses, and took a confirmation class among them. Miss Nightingale relied, however, upon her own influence also. During her residence in London she now made a point of seeing regularly all the Sisters, nurses, and probationers attached to her school. She had resolved, when Agnes Jones died, to "give herself up to finding more Agnes Joneses." This was the task to which she had now devoted a large part of her life. She was now untiring in the attempt to procure promising raw material. She applied to Mr. Spurgeon, among others, who in reply (July 29, 1877) hoped that from his church "there would come quite a little army of recruits for your holy war. Rest assured that to me in common with all of my countrymen your name is very fragrant." When applications came to her for trained nurses from provincial towns, she used to tell them what Pastor Flindler said when similar applications came to him for trained deaconesses from Kaiserswerth: "Have you sent me any probationers? I can't stamp raw material out of the ground." From 1872 onwards all the "raw material" passed under Miss Nightingale's own eye. She was a shrewd judge of character. A collection of extracts from Mr. Jowett's notes to her about his pupils, and of her penciled notes upon her pupils, would furnish a gallery of types of young Englishmen and Englishwomen. He used to write to her freely about his undergraduates, and she liked it, teasing him sometimes about his dukes and marquises, and inventing humorous nicknames for them. "Why do I write you," he said, "about all these young men? Because it pleases me, and because I know that you are a student of human nature." She was indeed. She read her visitors through and through. As soon as a sister or a nurse took leave, Miss Nightingale wrote down a memorandum of the attainments, knowledge, and character of each. The character sketches are terse and vivid, expressed sometimes in racy English. "Miss A. Tippity, flippant, pretensiony, veil down, ambitious, clever, not much feeling, talky, underbred, no religion, may be persevering from ambition to excel, but takes the thing up as an adventure like Nap 3. Nurse B. A good little thing, spirited, too much friends with G. shares in her flirtations. Miss C. Seems a woman of good feeling and bad sense, much under the meridian of anyone who will try to persuade her. I think her praises have been sung exaggeratedly. She wants a very steady hand over her. Such long-winded stories! 5 points are at least half the compass off the subject in hand. Had I not been intent on persuading her, I should have been out of all patience. Miss D. As self-comfortable as Jackass, or Jonas, as I ever saw. Nurse E. A most capable little woman, no education, but one can't find it in one's heart to regret it. She seems as good as can be. Miss X. More cleverness than judgment, more activity than order, more hard sense than feeling, never any high view of her calling, always thinking more of appearances than of the truth, more flippant than witty, more petulance than vigor. Nurse Y. As poor a two-fisted thing as I ever saw. a mocking to frighten away good nurses. There were many sisters and nurses so excellent in every respect that they needed nothing but encouragement. She was more careful to mark defects, and sometimes she would write a note of warning or remonstrance immediately after an interview. As to Miss C, a wise man says the true knowledge of anything, whether in heaven or earth, can only be gained by a true love of the ideal in it, that is, of the best that we can do in it. Forgive me, dear Miss C. Do you think that you have the true love of the best in nursing? This is a question I ask myself daily in all I do. Do not think me governessing. It is a question which each one of us can only ask of and answer to herself. The notes which Miss Nightingale took of conversations with probationers did not refer only to those ladies themselves. She questioned them closely of the state of the wards, the kind and extent of instruction they received, and the influence exerted by the several sisters. She came to the conclusion that the probationers were not always adequately taught by the sisters, and she drew up accordingly a memorandum of instruction to ward sisters on their duties to probationers. In one of her cross-examinations of herself she wrote, "God meant for me a reformer, and I have turned out a detective." But the reformer must needs on occasion play the detective, especially if she cannot herself be on the scene. The close hand which Miss Nightingale kept upon her school during these years, from her room at the South Street or at Lea Hurst, is extraordinary, but it was done at a prodigious expenditure of labour. She notes the point herself. It was one of the sore trials of her lot that she had to "write 100 letters to do one little thing, instead of being able to do it directly. It takes a great deal out of me," she wrote to a friend. "I have never been used to influence people, except by leading, in work, and to have to influence them by talking and writing is hard. A more dreadful thing than being cut short by death is being cut short by life in a paralyzed state." Miss Nightingale's sense of the seriousness of the nurse's vocation by no means stifled her appreciation of fun. Each nurse had to write once a month a report, for submission to the Chief, of a day's work in the wards. "I well remember," says one of her pupils, "coming off duty one evening at 8 p.m., fagged, footsore, and weary. On entering the home, the Sister informed me that my report must be written immediately. We never knew beforehand on which day this sword of Damocles would fall upon us. So after a hurried supper I commenced jotting down the day's work. One of the rules was that everything we had done in the wards must be entered. A combination of truthfulness and temper resulted in the following paragraph: 8:15 a.m. Tooth combed 7 heads, had grand sport. Mixed bag, measured 1 teaspoonful. Cleanliness is next to godliness." Miss Nightingale, when she came to know me, had a hearty laugh at this cheeky probationer's description of sport in hospital coverts. The cheekiness by no means prejudiced Miss Nightingale against the pupil, who a few years afterwards was selected for a very responsible post. To be invited to tea and talk with the Chief was regarded as a great honor by her pupils, but, as young people will, they sometimes made fun of it among themselves. "Carefully dressed in my best garments, I was just starting off on my first visit to South Street, when one of the nurses rushed up to me exclaiming, 'Miss Nightingale always gives the cake to the probationer who has tea with her, and the size of the cake varies accordingly to the poverty or otherwise of the nurse's dress.' So I hurried upstairs, exchanged my best coat for one that had done country service for many years, and came home from my tea party the proud possessor of a cake so large that it went round of all 36 probationers." This story was also told presently to Miss Nightingale, who enjoyed it hugely. She herself often wrote in a playful vein, as in this note to a pupil who was not taking due care of herself: "Ah, what a villain you are, I know you. If any one else were to do as you do in nursing yourself, you would discharge her from the face of the earth. And see the results. Then I'll be bound you've eaten none of those victuals yourself." End of Part 7, Chapter 3. Miss Nightingale's School. Part 7, Chapter 3 of The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Emily Olson. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook. Miss Nightingale's School, continued. The dossier which Miss Nightingale preserved and annotated often picking out special points by black, blue, and red pencil respectively, were of use to her in the important work of selecting particular ladies for particular posts. The most notable appointment during these years was that of a lady superintendent to organize district nursing in London. We have already heard that Miss Nightingale regarded this development as the proper sequel to the reform of workhouse nursing. That was in 1866, and now she reproached herself. I had then resolved to give myself to promoting district nursing, and now that district nursing comes it is too late for me to help. This lament, however, was unnecessary. It was Miss Nightingale's published Suggestions upon which the promoters of this movement acted. Foremost among them was Mr. Rathbone, who was moved to extend to London the experiment which he had carried out successfully in Liverpool. He at once came to consult Miss Nightingale. It was her letter to the Times, too, printed as a pamphlet, that made the Metropolitan Nursing Association well known to the public. In this letter, as in all her writings on the same subject, Miss Nightingale insisted that nothing second best would be good enough for nursing among the sick poor, that such nurses must be health missionaries, and that to obtain suitable women for the service there must be a real home within reach of their work for their nurses to live in. The system thus inaugurated in London was, she said, 20 years ago a paradox, but 20 years hence will be a commonplace. But the chief of the direct services which Miss Nightingale rendered to the movement was in persuading one of the all best of her pupils, Miss Florence Lees, Miss Dacre Craven, to accept the position of Superintendent General. She filled the post with high efficiency for some years, and throughout her work was in constant consultation with Miss Nightingale. In April 1878 it looked as if Miss Nightingale would have to find some superintendents and nurses for another purpose. War with Russia was believed to be imminent. 2 army corps were being prepared for the immediate embarkation, and Sir William Weir, Director General of the Army Medical Department, came to a consultation in South Street upon the female nursing establishment to be dispatched to the unknown seat of war. Miss Nightingale spent some anxious days and sleepless nights in considering which of her pupils were best fitted and could best be spared for this special service, but the war cloud passed away. The appointment of Miss Lees to organize district nursing in London was only one, though it was the most important, of many responsible appointments over which Miss Nightingale took infinite pains in order to place the right person in the right place. Hospitals and workhouse infirmaries in London and in various parts of the country looked to the Nightingale School for superintendents, or sometimes if an important post were thrown open by advertisement, Miss Nightingale used her influence to secure the election of a Nightingale candidate. Here again her labor was the greater because she was not herself on the spot and had others to consult. There was a triumvirate, she used to say, the triumvirs being Mr. Henry Bonham Carter, the secretary of the Nightingale Fund, Miss Wardroper, the matron, and Miss Nightingale, here as in the Crimea the lady-in-chief, with Dr. Sutherland sometimes in the background as a court of ultimate appeal. Whenever an important post fell vacant the amount of cross correspondence was prodigious. As soon as a lady was selected by the triumvirate for promotion, Miss Nightingale would call the chosen pupil more closely to her, make her intimate acquaintance, and prepare her for the work. Then there was the difficult duty of effecting exchanges. The sisters, when they had once left St. Thomas's, were, after all, free agents, and though the deference which they all paid to Miss Nightingale's wishes was great, yet the ladies had ambitions, preferences, views of their own, and her influence had often to be exercised by humoring, petting, coaxing. To Miss Rachel Williams, 35 South Street, January 17, 1874. We thought that this arrangement was what would approve itself best to your best judgment, but as I am well aware that my dear goddess baby has, well, a baby side, I shall not be surprised at any outburst, though I know full well that in the dear Pearl's terrible distress you will do everything and more than everything possible to drag her through and to spare her and to keep her up and the place going. Only don't break yourself down, my dear child. Alas, I would so fain relieve you of your bitterness. You say you are bitter, and indeed you are. I would not have written thus much unless urged by seeing my goddess baby suffering from delusions. And how can a woman be a superintendent unless she has learnt to superintend herself? To the same, May 2nd, 1874. I have this moment received your charming letter, which is just like yourself, and I must write and thank you for it at once. It has taken a load off my heart. It is a pure joy to me, because I see yourself and not another in it, and life has not many joys for me, my darling. To the same, December 5th, 1874. After much consideration, my suggestion was that you should remain another 6 months in the position, not because I had any idea of your remaining indefinitely on and on as you are, but because Edinburgh serves as a capital and indispensable preparation. But this is only an old woman's advice, which probably the goddess will not much regard, and which is subject anyway, of course, to hearing your own wishes, ideas, and reasons for one course or another. If there is such violent haste, telegraph to me any day, and come up by the next express or on the wires, and I will turn out India, my mother, and all the Queen's horses and all the Queen's men together, as 1/6 of the human race, and lay my energies, not many left, at the goddess's feet. Miss Nightingale had a large heart and an unprejudiced mind. She was open to discern character and efficiency in many different forms, but naturally there were those among her pupils by whom she was more particularly attracted. The letters just quoted introduce us to 2 of these. One of them Miss Nightingale noted in her diary, after the first interview. "Miss P. came. I found a pearl of great price." The name was adopted, and she became in familiar correspondence the Pearl. She filled important posts, and became one of Miss Nightingale's dearest friends. Of the other probationer she wrote: "Besides the pleasure of becoming acquainted with Miss Williams, it was quite a pleasure to my bodily eyes to look at her. She is like a queen, and all her postures are so beautiful without being in the least theatrical." This lady was the goddess of the letters already quoted. She was for many years matron of St. Mary's Hospital in London, with a training school under her, and she was afterwards appointed Lady Superintendent of Nurses during the Egyptian campaign of 1884–85. Even her marriage shortly afterwards did not break her friendship with Miss Nightingale. Sometimes a pupil on leaving St. Thomas's would take a situation against Miss Nightingale's advice or without consulting her. "I should feel happier," wrote one pupil, "if you saw the matter in the same light as I do." I expect that in such a case the self-willed pupil had to do very well in her post in order to win Miss Nightingale's approval. There were few important posts in the nursing world which were not filled during these years, and the following years, by pupils of the Nightingale School. An appointment which gave special satisfaction to Miss Nightingale and her council was that of Miss Martian to be matron of St. Bartholomew's (1878). At one and the same time (1882), former Nightingale probationers held the post of matron or of superintendent of nurses in the following, among other institutions: Cumberland Infirmary, Carlisle; Edinburgh Royal Infirmary; Huntingdon County Hospital; Leeds Infirmary; Lincoln County Hospital; at Liverpool in the Royal Infirmary; the Southern Hospital; at Liverpool in the Royal Infirmary, the Southern Hospital, and the Workhouse Infirmary; Netley, Royal Victoria Hospital; Putney, Royal Hospital for Incurables; Salisbury Infirmary; Sydney North-South-West, General Hospital, and in London at Marylebone Workhouse Infirmary; the Metropolitan and National Nursing Association; the North London District Nursing Association; the Paddington Association; St. Mary's Hospital, and the Westminster Hospital. To many of these institutions a large number of nurses, forming in some cases a complete nursing staff, had been provided from the Nightingale School, and the result was the gradual introduction into British hospitals of an organized system of trained nursing. The movement was not confined to Great Britain. Nightingale nurses became matrons or superintendents in many colonies, for example, Canada and Ceylon, in India, in Sweden, in Germany, and in the United States. Moreover, other hospitals and institutions had followed the lead of Miss Nightingale and established training schools, and several of these were again superintended by her pupils, as for instance at Edinburgh, under Miss Pringle; at the Marylebone Infirmary, Miss Vincent; at St. Mary's, Miss Williams; and at the Westminster, Miss Payne. These schools in their turn sent out lady superintendents, matrons, and nurses to other institutions, and thus the movement of the waters, which Miss Nightingale was able to start after her return from the Crimea, extended in an ever-widening circle. "Let us hail," she said in an address to her probationers (1884), "the success of other training schools, sprung up, thank God, so fast and well in latter years. But the best way we can hail them is not to be left behind ourselves. Let us, in the spirit of friendly rivalry, rejoice in their progress as they do, I'm sure, in ours. All can win the prize. One training school is not lowered because others win. On the contrary, all are lowered if others fail." The appointment of a Nightingale nurse to a post outside St. Thomas's did not mean that she passed out of Miss Nightingale's ken. On the contrary, it meant, as we have already heard (page 191), that her cares took further scope. "I am immersed," she wrote to M. Mohl (June 21, 1873), "in such a torrent of my trained matrons and nurses, going and coming, to and from Edinburgh and Dublin, to and from watering places for their health, dining, teaing, sleeping by day as well as by night." Her attitude to her lieutenants, says one of them, was that of a mother to daughters, yet they were not living with her in an enclosure, but were out in the open, encountering the experiences of their individual lives, often under very difficult conditions. When they confided their trials to her, she advised them in the spirit of her own high aims, wrestling with them or encouraging them, as the case might be, with fullness of attention, which might lead each one of us in turn to think she had no other care. Miss Nightingale's own papers and letters to nurses which I have seen, bear out all this in the fullest degree and to an amazing point of detail. With an erring sister she took infinite pains. She was firm to save from any discredit the good name of the Nightingale School, and to maintain the efficiency of its work. But this firmness went hand in hand with infinite pity for the individual, and any pain which her discipline may have caused to others was as nothing compared to the agony which her own tender and self-torturing soul endured. All Nightingale's sisters were her daughters, alike in Canada or in Scotland, as at St. Thomas's. She advised them, helped them, planned for them with extraordinary thoroughness. Was a sister returning to work in the north after a holiday in London, she would remember how careless girls sometimes are of regular meals, and her commissionaire would be dispatched to see the sister off and put a luncheon basket in the carriage. Miss Nightingale was an old hand at purveying, and amongst her papers are careful lists of what such baskets were to contain. She heard of a member of a certain nursing staff being run down. "What Miss X wants is to be fed like a baby," she wrote, sending a detailed dietary, and adding, "Get the things out of my money." She was constant in seeing that her daughters took proper holidays, sometimes helping to defray the expense, more often having them to stay with her in South Street or in the country. She was constant, too, in sending them presents of books, both of a professional kind likely to be of help to them in their work, and such as would encourage their taste for general literature. To those who were in London hospitals or infirmaries, her notes were often accompanied by fresh country eggs, game, or flowers. She always remembered them when Christmas came round, and sent evergreens for the wards. At one of the London infirmaries there is a matron's garden, planted with rhododendrons. The plants were sent by Miss Nightingale from Embley. To the nurses serving under her friends she sent presents also. She had a verse of the hospital hymn finely illuminated on a large scale, and gave it, suitably framed, to various institutions. She was as curious and as helpful in relation to the nursing arrangements in other hospitals as in St. Thomas's itself. Her pupils, wherever they might be, referred to their "dear mistress" or "dearest friend" in all their trials, difficulties, perplexities, and she never failed them, sending words of encouragement, advice, and good cheer. "Should there be anything in which I can be of the least use, here I am," was the frequent formula in her messages. In these letters a religious note is seldom absent. Never, I imagine, has there been a series of letters in which a high ideal was more continually and persistently presented. But the letters are not conspicuous for shrewd practical sense and worldly wisdom, as, for instance, when she advises a candidate for a certain post not to frighten the hospital board by starting a suggestion at once to reform the whole system. Miss Nightingale put a high value, too, on esprit de corps, as an aid to maintaining a high standard of duty. Every pupil of the Nightingale School was taught to think of it as an alma mater to which she owed much, even as she had received much. All the Sisters who went out into the world from the school were encouraged to regard themselves as members still of a corporate body, however widely separated from one another they might be. Miss Nightingale's letters often included news of one "old boy," so to speak, passed on to another. Each was inspired to take courage from the success of others. The volume of correspondence thus grew from year to year as the circle widened, and at the time with which we are now concerned it was enormous. The wonder is how Miss Nightingale was able to do anything else besides. Mothers with large families sometimes find the burden of correspondence heavy, as the sons and daughters leave home and have families of their own. Headmasters who make a point to keeping in touch with old pupils find it heavier still when they are called upon to advise or sympathize with each successive school generation upon openings, prospects, careers. The secretaries of the appointment boards, which now organize this kind of work in the case of universities, do not find their duties light. Combine these functions of mother, headmaster, and appointments board, and an idea will be obtained of Miss Nightingale's work as the nursing chief. A selection of extracts from particular letters to various correspondents will perhaps convey the impression better than any further attempt at general description. The extracts are only not typical in that I omit details about nursing arrangements and hospital cases. To a matron whose assistant was leaving to undertake a new work. 35 South Street, September 30th, 1876. 6 a.m. My dearest little sister, this comes that you may know, though you cannot know, how much one is thinking of you here below, in what must be a terrible wrench in our lot, as to the little mother who is left behind and to the daughter who goes to try her fate, even in the happiest change of a new and untried future. It must be a terrible wrench. But if I am thinking and feeling and praying for you so much, how must the One above feel for you? A sober view both you and I take of the possible futures of life, veiled in mist and sometimes, nay often in drizzle, with gleams of the Father's love in bright sunshine, and both of us knowing well that behind the clouds He is still shining, brightly shining, the Sun of righteousness. Though I ought to take a far soberer view than you, my dear little sister, for I have undergone twice your years, and for the same reason I ought to, though I am afraid faith often fails me, to take a brighter view too. But whether I do or not, and whether I write or not, your trials shall always be my trials, dear little sister. Your people shall be my people, as my God is your God. There can be no stronger tie. I think this letter will reach you just as Miss Williams has started. She will find a letter of welcome from me at St. Mary's. I dare say just now she feels dreary enough, but her great spirit will soon buckle to her work, and find a great joy in it. I am glad she takes some of your own people. I do earnestly trust that you will find help and comfort in Miss Payne, to whom my best love, and Miss Mitchelson. I am sure you do not feel so stranded as I did when I was left at Scutari in the Crimea War alone, when Mr. and Mrs. Bracebridge went home, on many, many times since, when Sidney Herbert, the War Minister with whom I had worked 5 years in the War Office, died, when Sir John Lawrence, the Indian Viceroy, left India, and many other times when the future fell across my life like a great black wall, not, as in other lives, making a change, but completely cutting off the future from the past. And again when my father's death brought upon me a load of cares, which would have been too great had I had nothing else to do, and had I been in health. I tell you these things, my dear little sister, or rather my dearest child, because I was going to say something, but I can only pray. Give all our members of our common calling with you who remember me my heartfelt sympathy that they are losing Miss Williams, and give them my joy that they have you. God bless us all. A solemn blessing. F.N. To a nurse confronted with a difficult situation. Lea Hurst, August 30th, 1873. It is quite useless for either you or me to take upon ourselves the solution of this enormous difficulty. we must leave it to God. But at present the duty is plain, and God always helps those who are obeying his call to duty, often gives them the privilege of saving others. Do you remember the great London theatre which was burnt down at the Christmas pantomime? Who were the heroes then? The poor clown and the poor pantaloon who were at their duty. The audience who were there because they liked it made a selfish stampede, and but for a lucky accident might have all been crushed or burnt. But the clown and the pantaloon, though there was not a moment to save a shawl or a coat to throw over the ballet dancers, gauze-dressed women who, if a spark had fallen upon them, would have been instantly in a blaze, actually carried out every one of these women to safety in the snow, gauze and all. And the carpenter collected the poor little ballet children, and dragged them through the snow and slush to his own house, where he kept them in safety. Brave clown, brave pantaloon, brave carpenter, while the selfish audience, who were there for amusement, almost jostled each other to death. So does God always stand by those who are there for duty, though they be only a clown or a pantaloon. All our cares arise from one of two things. Either we have not taken up our work for his love, in which case we know he has bound himself to take our cares upon him, or we do not sufficiently see his love in calling us to his work. To a Lady Superintendent, 35 South Street, December 30th, 1874. I wish you and all our nurses God speed, with all my soul and strength at the beginning of this new year, which I hardly expected to see. May it bring every blessing to them, though sometimes, do you know, I am so cowardly that I scarcely dare say God bless you to those I love well, because I know what his blessings are. Blessed are they that mourn, blessed are they that are persecuted for righteousness' sake, blessed are the pure in heart. And as we get on in life, we know how truly those blessings are blessings, and how much there is to go through to win them. You are young, my dear, 1,000 years younger than this old black beetle, and I have often a shuddering sort of maternal feeling in wishing you blessings. To a matron who is having a dispute with her committee. My thoughts are your thoughts. They are full of your, may I not say our, sad affair, and I was just sending you a note to ask what was doing when your sad little note came. Is not the thing of first importance to lay a statement of the whole case before your President? Nay, would it not be breaking faith with him if it were not done? This is now being done. Is not the next thing for you to take no step till you know the results of this letter to him? The next action he will take? You will remember that I stated to him at your friend's suggestion and at yours, that you wished for, that you invited, a full investigation to be made by him, and that you wished to abide by his decision. I thought this so important, in order that I might not appear to be asking for any personal favor, but only for justice as I underlined it. Will it not seem as if you were afraid to await his full understanding of the case, how far from the truth, if you precipitately resigned before he had time to even consider the statement? The matron must show no fear, else it would indeed be sacrificing the fruit of 8 years' most excellent work. Surely she should wait quietly, that is the true dignity, with her friends around her, till the President's answer is given. The persecuted for righteousness' sake never run away. To a matron after a visit to South Street. Dear little sister and extraordinary little villainess. You absconded last night just as your dinner was going up, and it would not have taken you longer to eat your dinner here than your supper at hospital. I was a great goose not to make certain of this when you arrived, but I thought it was agreed. To punish you, I send your dinner after you. To the same. 10 South Street, April 21st, 1879. Dearest, very precious to me is your note. I almost hope you will not come tomorrow. The weather is so cold here. St. Mary's expects you, and next do I. Be sure that the word trouble is not known where you are concerned. Make up your dear mind to a long holiday. That's what you have to do now. God bless you. We shall have time to talk. Thus day after day and year after year did such correspondence continue, now grave, now gay, filled alike with affection and with counsel. I have counted as many as 100 letters received in a year from a single superintendent. There were several years in which the total of Miss Nightingale's nursing correspondence has to be counted in thousands. As the years passed, the demands on her affections, her brain power, and her bodily strength became well nigh overwhelming. End of Part 7, Chapter 3, Miss Nightingale's School Continued. Part 7, Chapter 3 of The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Emily Olson. The Life of Florence Nightingale, Volume 2, by Edward Tyas Cook. Miss Nightingale's School continued. Miss Nightingale did not only rely upon individual intercourse for the exercise of influence. She believed in the pulpit as well as the closet, and from time to time addressed the probationer nurses collectively. Of the first of the series, written in 1872, Dr. Sutherland, to whom Miss Nightingale submitted her manuscript, said, "It is just what it ought to be, written as the thoughts come up. This is the only writing which goes like an arrow to its mark. It is full of gentle wisdom and does for hospital nursing what your notes did for nursing." It is the best of her addresses, and the medical officers at St. Thomas's insisted on every probationer mastering it. The gist of them is that nursing requires a special call, that it needs, more than most occupations, a religious basis, that it is an art in which constant progress is the law of life, and lastly, that the nurse, whether she wills it or not, has of necessity a moral influence. These ideas appear in almost every address, and are illustrated in various ways. A woman who takes the sentimental view of nursing, which she calls ministering, as if she were an angel, is of course worse than useless. A woman possessed with the idea that she is making a sacrifice will never do, and a woman who thinks any kind of nursing work beneath a nurse will simply be in the way. The true nurse must have a vocation, and, next, she must follow the call in a religious spirit. If we have not true religious feeling and purpose, hospital life, the highest of all things with these, becomes without them, and a mere routine and bustle, and a very hardening routine and bustle. To follow nursing as a religious vocation is, however, not enough, for it is a difficult art, requiring constant study and effort. This is the note which Miss Nightingale struck in the opening words of her first address, and it is the one which most frequently recurs. The besetting sin of the Nightingale nurses in the early days was, it seems, self-sufficiency. They knew that their training school was the first of its kind, and they were apt to give themselves airs. Mr. Henley's character sketches in verse of the Lady Probationer and Staff Nurse New Style hint pleasantly at this, and in plain prose men used to write of the conceited Nightingales. The days gone by, it was said in a medical journal, when a novel would picture a nurse as a Mrs. Gamp. She would figure rather as an active, useful, and clever, but also as a pert and very conceited young woman. Self-sufficiency, then, is the failing which the chief of the nurses constantly chastises. She does so by holding up before her pupils the ideal of nursing as a progressive art. For us who nurse, she says, our nursing is a thing in which, unless in it we are making progress every year, every month, every week, take my word for it, we are going back. The more experience we gain, the more progress we can make. The progress you make in your year's training with us is as nothing to what you must make every year after your year's training is over. A woman who thinks in herself, "Now I am a full nurse, a skilled nurse. I have learnt all there is to be learnt." Take my word for it, she does not know what a nurse is, and she will never know. She has gone back already. This rule applies to the technical side of the work, and perhaps yet more to the moral side. Nurses cannot avoid exercising a moral influence. They exercise it by their characters, and no point can ever be reached at which a woman can say, "Now my character is perfect." Nurses are not chaplains. It is what a nurse is in herself, and what comes out of herself, out of what she is, almost without knowing it herself, that exercises a moral or religious influence over her patients. No set form of words is of any use, and patients are so quick to see whether a nurse is consistent always in herself, whether she is what she says to them, and if she is not, it is no use. If she is, of how much use may the simplest word of soothing, of comfort, or even of reproof, especially in the quiet night, be to the roughest patient. But if she wishes to do this, she must keep up a sort of divine calm and high sense of duty in her own mind, and every good nurse ought to wish to do this, because her opportunities are unique. Hospital nurses have charge of their patients in a way that no other woman has charge. No other woman is in charge really of grown-up men. Also the hospital nurse is in charge of people when they are singularly alive to impressions. She leaves her stamp upon them whether she will or no. Such are the leading ideas which Miss Nightingale develops in her series of hospital sermons. I have heard it said that she addressed the nurses in the style and spirit of the Sunday School. There are passages to which such a description may be applied, but, taken as a whole, the discourses suggest a different comparison. They recall the style and spirit of the best public school or college sermons. Sometimes the likeness is close and explicit. On one occasion Miss Nightingale thought that the prevailing evil in her school was a spirit of irresponsible and ill-informed criticism. She rebuked it by telling a true story, which perhaps she may have had from Mr. Jowett. In a large college, questions about things which the students could but imperfectly understand in the conduct of the college had become too warm. The superintendent went into the hall one morning, and after complimenting the young men on their studies, he said, "This morning I heard 2 of the porters, while at their work, take up a Greek book lying on my table. One tried to read it, and the other declared it ought to be held upside down to be read. Neither could agree which was upside down, but both thought themselves quite capable of arguing about Greek, though neither could read it. They were just coming to fisticuffs when I sent the 2 on different errands." Not a word was added. The students laughed and retired, but they understood the moral well enough, and from that day there were few questions or disputes about the plans and superiors of the college, or about their own obedience to rules and discipline. Then, again, what boy has not heard in chapel or in school song a moral drawn from how things will look 40 years on? Here is Miss Nightingale's passage on the theme. Most of you here present will be in a few years in charge of others, filling posts of responsibility. All are on the threshold of active life. Then our characters will be put to the test, whether in some position of charge or of subordination, or of both. Shall we be found wanting, unable to control ourselves, therefore unable to control others? With many good qualities, perhaps, but owing to selfishness, conceit, to some want of purpose, some laxness, carelessness, lightness, vanity, some temper, habits of self-indulgence, or want of disinterestedness. Unequal to the struggle of life, the business of life, and ill adapted to the employment of nursing, which we have chosen for ourselves, and which, almost above all others, requires earnest purpose and the reverse of all these faults. 30 years hence, if we could suppose us all standing here again passing judgment on ourselves, and telling sincerely why one has succeeded and another has failed, why the life of one has been a blessing to those she had charge of, and another has gone from one thing to another, pleasing herself and bringing nothing to good. What would we give to be able now to see all this before us? Then she exhorted her pupils not to be too nice in the picking and choosing of places. Our brains are pretty nearly useless if we only think of what we want and should like ourselves, and not of what posts are wanting us, what our posts are wanting in us. What would you think of a soldier who, if he were to be put on duty in the honorable post of difficulty, as sentry may be, in the face of the enemy, and we nurses are always in the face of the enemy, always in the face of life or death for our patients, were to answer to his commanding officer, no, he had rather mount guard at barracks or study musketry, or if he had to go as pioneer, or on a forlorn hope, were to say, no, that don't suit my turn. So again, there are excellent little discourses on the uses and limits of school friendships, on the right use of dress, and on the art of exercising authority, with wise sayings taken direct in some cases from Plato. Those who rule must not be those who are desirous to rule. The world, whether of a ward or of an empire, is governed, not by many words, but by few, though some, especially women, seem to expect to govern by talk and nothing else. She who is the most royal mistress of herself is the only woman fit to be in charge. For she who has no control over herself, who cannot master her own temper, how can she be placed over others, to control them through the better principle, if she has none or little of her own? Her remarks on dress are interesting, and might be applied mutatis mutandis to young men who sometimes combine a habit of slovenliness with a garish taste in waistcoats. Some of the Nightingale nurses seem to have grumbled at the uniform, and have taken their revenge upon it by gorgeous apparel when off duty. Miss Nightingale avers that to her eye no woman's dress is so becoming as that of her nurses, and for the rest she draws a moral from God's "clothing" of the field flowers. First, their clothes are exactly suitable for the kind of place they are in, and the kind of work they have to do. So should ours be. Second, field flowers are never double. Double flowers change their useful stamens for showy petals, and so have no seeds. These double flowers are like the useless appendages now worn on the dress, and very much in your own way, wild flowers have purpose in all their beauty. So ought dress to have. Nothing purposeless about it. Third, the colors of the wild flower are perfect in harmony, and not many of them. Fourth, there is not a speck on the freshness with which flowers come out of the dirty earth. Even when our clothes are getting rather old, we may imitate the flower, for we may make them look as fresh as a daisy. Oh, my dear nurses, whether gentlewomen or not, don't let people say of you that you are like girls of the period. Let them say that you are like field flowers, and welcome. Miss Nightingale often sought, as every good school preacher seeks, to arrest the attention of the young by topical allusions, especially to stirring and heroic deeds. She often compared hospital nurses to missionaries, and held up Livingstone as an example. He was one of the best missionaries, not as going about with a Bible in his hand and another in his pack, but by the influence of his own purity, fidelity, and uprightness. She introduced in similar factions stories of Rorke's Drift, of Tel el Kebir, and of Gordon at Khartoum. More rarely she referred to incidents in her own career, and such passages, one can understand, must have sent a thrill through an audience in which most of the nurses looked up to Florence Nightingale as their honoured chief or queen. But when she thus referred to herself, it was only to say that any success or repute she had attained was due to faithful attention to the smallest details. The greatest compliment, she said, I ever received as a hospital nurse was this, that I was put to clean and "do" every day the special ward, with the severest medical or surgical case which I was nursing, because I did it thoroughly and without disturbing the patient. That was at the first hospital I ever served in. I think I could give a lesson in hospital housemaids' work now. I have had more experience, she said in another discourse, in all countries and in different ways of hospitals than almost anyone ever had before. But if I could recover strength so much as to walk about, I would begin all over again. I would come for a year's training to St. Thomas's Hospital under your admirable matron, and I venture to add that she would find me the closest in obedience to all our rules. Sure that I should learn every day, learn all the more from my past experience, and then I would try to be learning every day to the last hour of my life. And when his legs were cutted off, he fought on his stumps. The reading of the address from Miss Nightingale was one of the events of the nursing year. Sir Harry Verney, as chairman of the Nightingale Fund, often read the addresses to the assembled probationers, but they were also printed, and a copy was given to each nurse. For the most part they were written for the probationers at St. Thomas's, but from time to time Miss Nightingale sent a similar address to the Nightingale nurses serving in Edinburgh. The nurses had been asking me only a few days before, wrote the Lady Superintendent, January 6, 1875, whether you had remembered them this year, and were going to write them. Most of them prize your letters very much. They are trumpet calls to duty and to greater efforts for a higher standard. In some years there was another field day for the Nightingale nurses, when a party of them were invited by Sir Harry and Lady Verney to Claydon, and a long summer day passed in sauntering in the grounds or in lawn tennis ended with a short service in the church. On one or two of these occasions Miss Nightingale was able to be present, and photographs were taken of her seated in the midst of the nurses. The high ideal of the nurse's calling which Miss Nightingale cherished throughout her life, and strove to inculcate upon her disciples, explains her dislike of schemes of certification, registration, orders, and other professional organization. She was indeed much interested in, and she did much promote, the practice of thrift and provident assurance among the nurses. But further than this, in the organization of nursing as a kind of trade union, Miss Nightingale was never inclined to go, and, as we shall hear in a later chapter, she was altogether opposed to a professional register. There were those that maintained that the problem of improving nursing was an economic problem, that good pay would attract good nurses, that the market was spoiled by the intrusion of lady volunteers. But to Miss Nightingale nursing was a sacred calling, only to be followed by those who felt the vocation, and only followed to good purpose by those who pursued it as the service of God through the highest kind of service to man. There were those again who approached the problem from a point of view the opposite of the economic, and thought that a religious motive, in the ordinary sense of the term, was the sure way to good nursing, and who thus attached supreme importance to the organization in orders, companies, and the like. To this view Miss Nightingale was equally opposed. because to her nursing was an art, and the essence of success was artistic training. A collection of passages, taken from a mass of correspondence, etc., on the subject, may serve to make her point of view clear. The supply and demand principle taken alone is a fallacy. It leaves out altogether the important element, viz., the state of public opinion at the time. You have to educate public opinion up to wanting a good article. Patient pills are not provided to be good articles because the public pays heavily for them. Patent pills are not proved to be good articles because the public pays heavily for them. Many matrons are dear at £30 a year. Do you suppose that if we were to offer £150 we should get a good article at once? I trow not. And I say this from no theory, but from actual experience. It is very easy to pay. It is very difficult to find good nurses, paid or unpaid. It is trained nurses, not paid nurses, that we want. It is not the payment which makes the doctor, but the education. It is a question of no importance in regard to any art, whether the painter, sculptor, or poet is a lady, or a person working for her bread, a volunteer, or a person of the lower middle class. Some 30 years ago I remember reading Rejected Addresses. A gentleman, endeavoring to explain how a certain lady became the mother of Pantalowski, observes, "The finest of the weather, the blueness of her riding habit, all conspired to interest me." I quote from memory. We are pleased to hear that the weather was fine and that the habit was blue, but we do not see what they have to do with it. I am neither for nor against lady nurses. What a ridiculous term! What would they say if we were to talk about gentlemen doctors? I am neither for nor against paid nurses. My principle has always been that we should give the best training we could to any woman of any class, of any sect, paid or unpaid, who had the requisite qualifications, moral, intellectual, and physical, for the vocation of a nurse. Unquestionably, the educated will be more likely to rise to the post of superintendents, not because they are ladies, but because they are educated. The relation of a nursing staff to the medical officers is that of the building staff to an architect, and neither can know its business if not trained to it. To pit the medical school against the nurse training school is to pit the hour hand against the minute hand. The worst nursing in Europe is that of the sisterhoods, where no civil administration or medical school is admitted. The worst hospitals in Europe are those where no nurse training schools were admitted, and where the doctor is, in fact, the matron. You ask me whether it is possible to follow out successfully the profession of nursing except from higher motives. What are the higher motives? That is what I want to know. Nearly all the Christian orders will tell you. The first is to save your soul. The Roman Catholics will tell you to serve God's Church. But they do not infer that you are to strain mind and soul and strength in finding out the laws of health. The religious motive is not higher but lower if the element of religion enters in to impede this search. In the perfect nurse there ought to be what may be called 1. The physical or natural motive, 2. The intellectual or professional motive, and 3. The religious motive. All three. The natural motive is the love of nursing the sick, which may entirely conquer, as I know by personal experience, a physical loathing and fainting at the sight of operations, etc. And I do not believe that the higher motive, as it is usually called, can so disguise a natural disinclination as to make a nurse acceptable to the patients. The good nurse is a creature much the same all the world over, whether in her coif or cloister, or taking her £20 or £50 a year. The professional motive is the desire and perpetual effort to do the thing as well as it can be done, which exists just as much in the nurse as in the astronomer in search of a new star, or in the artist completing a picture. These may be thought fine words. I can only say that I have seen this professional ambition in the nurse who could hardly read or write, but who aimed just as much at perfection in her care and dressings as the surgeon did in his operation. The professional who does this has the higher motive, the religious who thinks she can serve God anyhow has not. But I do entirely and consistently believe that the religious motive is essential for the highest kind of nurse. There are such disappointments, such sickenings of the heart, that they can only be borne by the feeling that one is called to the work by God, that it is a part of His work, that one is a fellow worker with God. I do not ask for success, said dear Agnes Jones, even when she was taking every human means to ensure success, but that the will of God may be done in me and by me. Holding these convictions, Miss Nightingale believed much in individual influence, and little in organized institutions. "For my part," she said, "I think that people should always be founders, and this is the main argument against endowments. While the founder is there, his or her work will be done, not afterwards. The founder cannot foresee the evils which will arise when he is no longer there. Therefore let him not try to establish an order. This has been most astonishingly true with the order of the Jesuits as founded by S. Ignatius Loyola, and with S. Vincent de Paul's Soeurs de la Charité. It is quite immeasurable the breadth and length which now separates the spirit of those orders from the spirit of their founders. But it is no less true with far less ambitious societies. So then, Miss Nightingale had little faith in forms and institutions, and in one of her later addresses (1888) she expressed herself in terms of apprehensive scepticism about the validity of nursing certificates and associations, and of the importance attached to making nursing a profession. It was the higher motive, as interpreted above, to which she attached supreme importance, and for inculcating it she believed that only individual influence could avail. Did she succeed or fail herein? It may be that, in dearth of inspiring individuals, professional organization is the second best thing, and fills a useful place. Miss Nightingale herself was always more conscious of her failures than of her successes, but it is impossible for anyone who has been privileged to read the correspondence between Miss Nightingale and her pupils not to feel assured that the spirit of the founder was imparted to other high-minded women who carried the work into many fields. The best of her pupils were the most conscious, like their mistress, of shortcomings. "I have failed," wrote one of them, "in pouring out her soul during a holiday retrospect. Failed in the thing you most speak of. I failed in carrying on my nurses in the path towards perfection." But the master whispered, "Follow the gleam." Of one of her best pupils it was recorded that "she never spoke or cared to be reminded of what she had done. Her constant cry was, 'How many things still remain to be done!'" This lady was a true disciple of the founder. To the end of her life it was on the path towards perfection that Miss Nightingale's heart and mind were set. In her last years, when her secretary sought to interest her by talk about hospitals and nurses, she was never greatly pleased by any record of things well done. "Tell me," she would say, "of something which might be made better." End of Miss Nightingale's School continued. Recording by Emily Olson.